I want to start today with what is happening in Cuba, which is both horrifying and it's fascinating. It's politically relevant. And of course, we're all globally, as we'll talk about in a moment, every country in some way dealing with not just coronavirus generally, but also this resurgence of the virus, despite vaccinations starting to roll out because of the very contagious Delta variant. All of this relates to what's going on in Cuba. So let's start there. A very good article in the BBC explaining, generally speaking, what's happening in Cuba right now. If you've not been following it, there are essentially three issues here that are leading to massive protests in Cuba. First is, as is written here, the coronavirus crisis. The protests, the BBC writes, appear to be the result of societal exhaustion stemming from acute economic and health crises. The pandemic and economic measures taken by the government have made life in Cuba increasingly difficult. The island, which had kept the pandemic under control in 2020, has seen infections explode in recent weeks. We'll look at those numbers momentarily, but records in terms of daily infections, in terms of deaths, the healthcare system on the brink of collapse. That is one piece of it. And the hashtag SOS Cuba has been trending on Twitter. This is one of the areas that we've seen open slightly in Cuba is that of internet access. And now that leading to the SOS Cuba hashtag, which the government is not thrilled with. And we will talk about that in a moment. Number two, the economic situation. Tourism is one of the main engines for the Cuban economy, almost completely paralyzed as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. In addition, Cuba is seeing inflation, blackouts, food shortages, as well as shortages of medicine and basic products. Those aren't new issues, but they have been particularly worse lately. At the beginning of the year, the government proposed a new package of economic reforms that, while increasing wages, triggered a spike in prices. Economists such as Pavel Vidal from the Pontificia Javeriana University of Cali in Colombia estimate prices could rise between 500 and 900% in the next few months, starting to look like my birth country of Argentina from the standpoint of inflation. And then number three, internet access. Before Sunday, the largest protest Cuba had seen since the start of Castro's communist revolution took place in August of '94. Many Cubans had no idea what happened because of lack of internet access. 30 years on, the scenario is different. Under the presidency of Raul Castro, Cuba has taken some liberalizing steps, which increased internet connectivity. And as I mentioned earlier, as a result of that, Cubans have been using social networks to express dissatisfaction with the government. Mainly young people now have access to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and these platforms were used to organize the protests. So then we look at, well, what is the U.S. perspective on this? Because the U.S. has had crippling sanctions on Cuba for a very long time. Sanctions that, while I am not a communist and I am against the way that Cuba has operated with no open elections for decades, despite promises made during the 1950s and 60s, I'm completely against that. I also recognize the total hypocrisy of the U.S. saying, well, we can't tacitly endorse the way Cuba is run, and so we're putting sanctions on them. And yet we have the relationship we have with Saudi Arabia and many other countries. Okay, so I've talked about that before. Joe Biden yesterday during a press event bringing up the Cuban protests and saying the U.S. stands with the people of Cuba. Take a look at this.
Okay. Folks, I want to start by recognizing the remarkable protests that are taking place in Cuba. With the Cuban people demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. And I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time, if quite frankly ever. The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights. And we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence, their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba. And we're also closely following the developments in Haiti.
So this is a complicated issue. And anybody, you've got a lot of very right-wing Cubans in Florida, for example, who love Trump and who are saying we need to continue crushing the Cuban government and punishing them. We're just punishing the people if we do that. On the other hand, we also have to recognize that part of why things are the way they are in Cuba is because of American policy towards Cuba for decades. And so anybody who wants to sort of pigeonhole me on this issue and say, well, but so David, are you for or against or what you? No, we have to recognize that on the one hand, the U.S. has had a major role in keeping things worse in Cuba than they could otherwise be. We should be easing the sanctions that Trump put in. Remember that Barack Obama eased some sanctions. Donald Trump came in and reinstituted a lot of those sanctions. And although Joe Biden is on the one hand saying we're with the Cuban people, the very sanctions that Joe Biden has not eased that were put back in place by Donald Trump are part of why things are so bad. At the same time, I have been unquestionably against the authoritarian regime in Cuba all of this time. But we must recognize that the U.S. is friendly with many authoritarian regimes. And so singling out Cuba has been a hypocrisy for decades. Obviously, my main concern is the Cuban people. And these are massive and significant protests because of the internet access. This may be, we're seeing the repression from the police state of Cuba. And we're getting reports of, officers on every corner and everything you can imagine would go on is going on. At the same time, we can't ignore the U.S. role in Cuba being at least partially the way that it is now. We'll see over the next 48 hours the direction that the government response to the protests is going to take. One of our sponsors today is Blue Chew, a unique online service delivering the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis in a chewable form and at a fraction of the cost. And they're giving my audience an entire month's supply for free. So if you think you could benefit from an extra boost of confidence when it's time, all you have to do is take a short quiz on their website. A licensed doctor approves your prescription. The medication comes straight to your home within days in a discreet package. No driving around to the doctor's office or the pharmacy. No waiting around. No awkward conversations with your doctor. All of Blue Chew's tablets are made in the USA. The entire process is just a few clicks. Go to bluechew.com. The link is underneath this video. They'll give you an entire month's supply for free when you use the promo code Pakman. All you have to do is pay $5 shipping.